Glad for you to join us again in the study of the book of Isaiah. It has been about 2.5 years since we have been involved in this study, and I'm glad to finally get an opportunity to get back into this. I've been meaning to for some time. There have been numerous things have happened. A lot of changes have gone on in my life. I'm sure that you'll recognize I'm about 205 pounds lighter than in my last video after having had gastric surgery. Got my health back under control. Things are going very well as all of that is concerned, and I'm excited about getting back into our study. Now, in our last study, we got down through getting into chapter 43, and we're going to start there again soon. But I want to back up just a little bit to hit the ground running again for us to better understand where it is that we are in our study here. You might remember that as we introduced this several years ago, we looked at some of the introductory material as it relates to the book of Isaiah. One of those was authorship. And liberal scholarship has basically assigned two or three different Isaiahs to writing. It's called the Deutero or Trito Isaiah theory. And the belief is in the liberal scholarship is that not just one man wrote. My obvious belief is that there was only one Isaiah. Isaiah wrote all 66 chapters inspired by the Holy Spirit to do so. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16, 17, 2 Peter 1, 19 through 20. But the content of the book and the way that the book is laid out seems to be what fuels a lot of these false claims regarding authorship. Now, part of the problem is that there's a major section of the religious world today that does not believe in what we call predictive prophecy, and Isaiah is filled with that. Isaiah is referred to, you might recall, as the messianic prophet because of the number of prophecies there regarding Christ. But the different divisions to the book, and there's three, we're going to go over those again very briefly here in just a moment. But the fact that they are so different leads some to believe that there were two or three different men that wrote the book. We'll approach it briefly from the Trito Isaiah view. The three divisions of the book of Isaiah are as follows. Chapters 1 through 35 is probably the darkest section of the book, and it deals with the concept of a burden, and that is a difficult message to be delivered. It's dark, it's gloomy, it's depressing because the number of nations that were involved with Israel, all of these are going to go down, all of these are going to fall, and that's a major portion, a major concept of what's described in those first 35 chapters. Then in chapters 36 through 39, we have the second division of the book, and it's referred to as a historical interlude. It's about King Hezekiah. There are some messianic things in that chapter, but it largely deals with Hezekiah and his interaction with those around him at that time. At that time, Isaiah was written about 740 to 720 BC. We see a lot of what happened with Hezekiah right around 700 BC. So you're looking at a historical section that involved Hezekiah, one of the great reform kings of his time. And then we move into the last section of the book, and it's much more about hope. That's chapters 40 through 66. I want to talk about that a little bit more here in just a moment. But let's also indicate what's already gone on historically as Isaiah is writing. The 10 northern tribes of Israel had already been carried away into Assyrian captivity. Assyria was a major player. It was the world power at that time. And due to their idolatrous practices, the 10 northern tribes of Judah were carried away into captivity about 722, 721 BC. It's probable that Isaiah was very familiar with all of these surroundings. He may have seen these very things. But Isaiah wrote more about what was going to happen to Judah themselves. Judah eventually will be carried away into Babylonian captivity. That's prophesied in the book, that's dealt with in the book. We're going to see that addressed in this section. And then after Jeremiah's 70 years of captivity, not a literal 70 years, but a figurative period of time that was very close to 70 literal years, they were going to be in captivity. And then the remnant was going to be brought back into the land. We're going to see in this section a direct prophecy of one referred to as a servant of Yahweh, a servant of the Lord, servant of God, who's going to be instrumental in bringing the remnant back into the land. And it's going to be in the person of Cyrus. It's going to be about chapter 44 as we continue to move ahead. We'll be moving into that section very quickly. But let's take a look at what we're looking at here. This is a comfort section. It's a much more bright and cheerful section of the book of Isaiah. A dramatic change of tone occurs here. We're looking at reasons for comfort. The first section that we're going to study is chapters 40 through 48 of the book. We have a dramatic change of tone occurring in Isaiah chapter 40, and it's going to continue all the way to the end of the book, all the way to chapter 66. There's going to be some beautiful language going to be used, some beautiful pictures are going to be drawn, some great prophecies are going to be made, and we'll study those prophecies and their fulfillment in the course of the study as we move through completion of this book of Isaiah. This change in tone, while I'm not defending the Deutero and Trito Isaiah views of writing, this change of tone may very well be what fueled the belief that that was going to occur. At this point, Isaiah looks beyond the current threat of Assyria, and he's looking to a deliverance that he promised he would bring about for Judah, and it's going to occur after Babylonian captivity. Let's do a very quick timeline again to get these dates back in our mind as we resume this study and move ahead. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were carried away in the first wave of Babylonian captivity. That was about the year 606, 605 BC. Much of the early part of the book of Daniel deals with that time. We understand what occurred. We see the great examples of faith by Daniel and his three friends specifically as we move through those early chapters of the book of Daniel. Then in 597 BC, we have a second wave into captivity, and that's going to include Ezekiel and about 10,000 others are going to be carried away. The book of Ezekiel is characteristic of this time. Ezekiel was prophesying by the river Chebar there in Babylon. He was writing to deal with some of what was going on in Babylon, but also some of the problems that were continuing to go on back in Jerusalem, back in Judah at that time. Then in 586 BC, we have the third and final wave of captivity, and that is going to be where most of the others, except the poor and the sick, are going to be carried into Babylonian captivity. The temple is destroyed at that point, and Judah, as had Israel before, lost all national distinction from that point on. Never again in the Old Testament or the New, in the full context, will we see the nation of Israel or Judah referenced, because they lost that. From this point on in history, right on through the end of the first century, somebody else controls that land. It's Assyria. Now, it's going to be Babylon. The vision of Daniel in Daniel chapter 2 shows 4 world powers that are going to come and go before the establishment of the kingdom that's never going to be destroyed. Daniel chapter 2, verses 44 and 45. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome are those 4 powers. After this point, the land of Judah, the city of Jerusalem, is never again going to be owned by God's people. It's going to be on their mind for some time. I believe it's going to result in their misconceptions about the nature of the kingdom when Christ comes. Remember, after Christ's resurrection, before his ascension back to the Father, he's asked the question in Acts chapter 1, verse 6, will you at this time restore the kingdom? Even those with Jesus for about 3.5 years did not understand the full nature, largely because of having lost national distinction and wanting to get that back. I also believe that's a major catalyst for our understanding the book of Hebrews. Part of what they want is to attack Rome, to rebel against Rome, and to reestablish themselves as a nation again. That did not happen. They lost that as a consequence of their rejection of God, their rebellion of God, their acceptance of idolatry. All of those things were tantamount to that which resulted in their being carried away into captivity. And we're going to be looking at that as we move through. So now, 586 BC, we've got all three waves into captivity. Then in 536 BC, Cyrus, who we're going to read of and study about in chapter 44, specifically verse 28, signs a decree. You see, Assyria and Babylon had a foreign policy of going in, taking somebody captive, removing them from that land, taking other captives and putting them in that area. But Cyrus had a shift in foreign policy. He decided it would be better, people may be easier handled or dealt with if they were back in their own homes, with their own religion, their own sense of their own homes, some sense of freedom, if you will, even having their own leadership. Nehemiah will serve as one of their governors as the captivity goes back. So Cyrus signs that decree, sends God's people back. They go back in three waves. The first is in 536, where Zerubbabel is commissioned to go back in and to rebuild the temple. Then in 457, Ezra is going to go back, and his job is going to be to reinstitute the law. And then the third and final wave will be in 444 BC. You've got a memory hook of what's going to occur here. Nehemiah goes back and he rebuilds the wall around the city. So the city is refortified in 444 BC. So there's a time frame that we're going to be working through, dates that it will benefit us to remember as we move through this section and as we see these events unfold by prediction, because all of this is going to be predicted. One of I believe, the greatest proof of inspiration is that of predictive prophecy and its fulfillment. And we're going to see some very powerful prophecies made and fulfilled, very particular in nature. Some are going to be more general in nature. And because of that, there's a little bit more confusion as it relates to exactly how such are fulfilled. But Isaiah 44:28 is very clear, calls Cyrus by name well before his birth, and describes what he's going to do. And then the greatest piece of evidence is the first 12 verses of chapter 53 of the book of Isaiah. And that's where we see that great prophecy of Christ being crucified. The details are so graphic. They depict such detail that it's almost like someone is standing at the foot of the cross with a pen and a piece of paper and writing down the events as they transpire more than 700 years before they occur. So let's look at this section now. Let's transition into this area of comfort and kind of overview what we've looked at in chapters 40 through 42 of the book of Isaiah. And then that will prepare us for beginning our study in earnest again, probably in our next time together, as we look at as we begin looking at chapter 43 in earnest. So here we saw this dramatic change of tone that's occurring. Isaiah is looking beyond this threat of Assyria, and he's looking to some great fulfillment as it relates to what's going to happen with God's plan to redeem man. The concept, the servant of the Lord, becomes much more prevalent and prominent in this section. Scholars have identified 4 so-called servant songs that comprise some of this material in these 66 chapters. In these songs, Isaiah and the Messiah are both referred to as servants. Cyrus is going to be referred to as a servant as we move into chapter 44. These songs culminate, they come together with the great passage about the suffering servant. That's chapter 52, verse 13 through chapter 53 and verse 12. As I mentioned before, messianic passages are also much more abundant in chapters 40 through 66, and that's just due to the nature of this section, this division of the book of Isaiah. Approximately 50 verses from this final section, chapters 40 through 66, are quoted in the New Testament, compared to only 30 passages quoted from the first 35 chapters of the book of Isaiah. And that's just because of the content of the book. This is much more messianic. This is much more about the message of the New Testament. The first 35 chapters, though there are quotations that are pulled out, are more about what's going to happen to the nations that are faced or that God's people are dealing with. Many of these passages, many of these 50 in this section, are directly tied to the Messiah, Jesus Christ himself. Well, we talked about the theme of the book of Isaiah long before in our study. I like to be able to put a phrase, a simple phrase, over the first page of a book to help me understand and to keep drawing my focus to that as we move through the book. For example, in my New Testament, I have taken a red pen, and on the first page of the book of Hebrews, above the heading Hebrews, I wrote the word better. Because everything about the book of Hebrews is that we are in a covenant that is better than the Mosaic covenant. And the different ways it is better are delineated throughout the book of Hebrews. A better hope, a better instruction, a better leader. All of those are seen. A better relationship with God based upon better promises. So the word better helps me there. Saying that to say this, a theme, what I have over the book of Isaiah in my Bible is trust in God. 3 very simple words, but words that speak volumes about what would have negated everything negative we see in the book of Isaiah. Remember when God's people were gathered together in Egypt under the leadership of Joseph, because of what happened to Joseph, God providentially used them to fulfill one of the 3 promises to Abraham. One of the 3 promises is they were going to become a great nation. That occurred when they came into Egypt, and through God's providential working through Joseph, they were given the land of Goshen, and the book of Exodus opens up telling us that they had become a great nation. That's a key thought as we move through. As God took them out of Egypt and took them into the promised land under the leadership of Joshua, he fully intended to give them that land. It was a land flowing with milk and honey. That was the second promise given to Abraham, and that was the land promise. The land of Goshen was a great land, but it was not the land that God intended as it related to the promise of the land. That was Palestine as we know it. But that was a conditional promise. God would fight their battles as long as they stayed faithful to him. The Battle of Jericho showed that to be the case initially. Through faith, they marched around that city, and it fell under God's power. But then Achan did what God had forbidden them to do, and that was to take some devoted things. And after a time, that was figured out, and things were set back in motion. Joshua again led the people, and the land was theirs. The land was divided among the nation, the tribes of Israel. But we've already referred to the 10 northern tribes losing all of that. What happened? Did God fail? Did God not mean what he said regarding that promise? Or was there something else to be seen? The something else was that this promise was always conditional. The 10 northern tribes, when they abandoned God for their idols, were carried into Assyrian captivity. Likewise now, we're going to be dealing with a time and a message. Isaiah has spoken of it already, that these 2 southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin, what we call the tribe of Judah, the kingdom of Judah, they're also going to lose that land. And it's going to be because they rejected God and his will. Powerful lesson for us to learn is salvation is a beautiful promise for us. Heaven is a beautiful promise. It provides great hope for us. The promise that we'll be raised, if found faithful, to a newness of life throughout the New Testament is a key, but it's all conditional based upon our remaining faithful. Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10. So that's what this is all about. Salvation or deliverance is all a major theme here. It begins with the announcement in this section of deliverance from Babylonian captivity, and it ends with the promise of salvation, not only for Israel, but for everybody that would obey God's will. These themes refer to both the physical return from captivity and to the salvation that was to result from this coming Messiah, this becoming servant. So what do we have in chapters 40 through 42? Material we've already covered. Well, chapter 40 is all about the sovereignty and the majesty of God, the power and the authority of his word, and the fact that he is in control is made abundantly clear. As we move into chapter 41, we see that God rules. He's in control. He's sovereign. He's also king. He's Lord. They had rejected that. They have rejected all of that. Following the comfort and the assurance that's given there in chapter 40, God summoned Judah to recognize him as sovereign. He's the ruler of the world. In comparison to his power, the idols of the nations amounted to nothing. God alone could predict the future. And he predicted that one from the north would come. Then as we move into the last chapter we studied, chapter 42, justice is to be established. This chapter contains the first of the so-called servant songs that I referenced earlier on in this lesson. Scholars have debated the identity of this servant for some time, and there's apparently more than one that's addressed. But the servant above all others is Christ himself. Verses 1 through 4 of chapter 42 deal with the messianic servant of the Lord. Verses 5 through 9, God confirms what that servant's work is going to be as we move ahead. Israel, the blind servant, is addressed in verses 14 through 25. That's the unbelieving people of Israel. When the time came, God would act in behalf of his people. So this chapter depicts 2 servants, one who would accomplish the Lord's task and one who could still receive the blessing of deliverance. It was not too late. Hope was not lost. They had been punished. They're going to be punished. They're going to be carried into Babylonian captivity. They're going to suffer greatly. Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. The temple's going to be destroyed. Many are going to lose their lives. But there's a ray of hope through all of that. And that is a message to be understood through captivity is that God is not through at this time. And he's not through with Judah. Remember in Genesis 49:10, you've got the prophecy that the scepter would not depart from Judah until Shiloh comes, the one to whom it belongs. Scepter. That's something a king holds. It signifies rule, sovereignty, authority. In 2 Samuel chapter 7, David is given a promise. He's the king through whom the king, the Messiah, is to come. And David is given a promise in 2 Samuel 7 that line's not going to be broken, that Messiah is going to come. The kingdom is going to be established. And prophecies beginning with Genesis 49:10 as it relates to the kingdom are all going to be fulfilled. We're going to see that in the form of the church. We're going to see Christ as the Messiah. And we're going to see so many promises that are made as we move through that time into where that great promise is fulfilled. So as we begin our next study, or in our next study, we're ready now to look at the next chapter, chapter 43, in more detail. If you prefer, I still have all of these videos posted on my YouTube channel. You can go onto YouTube. You can just simply put in the search bar, Pat McIntosh, scroll down through, and all of these lessons are available. Chapter 67, or lesson 67, was the last one. That was chapter 42. If you want to back up, you can kind of hit the ground running, and we'll all be ready together to study chapter 43. Thank you again for your time. God bless you. God bless us as we study His Word, as we apply His Word, and as we reap the benefits of what God promised for us. Until next time, God bless you.